For if you believed Moses, you would believe and commit your trust to me, for he wrote in description about me. So when we go to the Torah, and in this particular case we're talking about the Passover, everything that Moses and the Israelites did, they did as a shadow picture of when the real Lamb would come and how he would fulfill it when he was here. And this is what we're going through in this whole lesson. Verse 47, but if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? And so how poignant it is how Yeshua makes this statement, because this is the paradox today. This is where we are in the body of Messiah today. We have the vast majority of people who have accepted hook, line, and sinker what Jewish traditionalism or Talmudic law or the traditions of the elders has handed down to us over the millennia. And it has been accepted without questioning it. And that's the problem. And so what he's saying is, if you didn't believe Moses' writings, how are you going to believe his words? And on this subject, of all subjects, this is probably one of the most important things that we should be believing Yeshua's own words about. And yet, sadly, we don't.
Restoring the Father's name, Yahweh. Restoring the Messiah's name, Yahshua. Re-establishing Torah covenant. Preparing the bride. The revealing of the sons of Elohim. Prophecy. The return of Melchizedek, the royal priesthood. Elijah's school of the prophets. The way ministries. A return to the Philadelphian spirit.
So breaking down the timeline, many assert that Yeshua did not eat the Passover. I mean, that is fought tooth and nail basically to death in the body of Messiah and in Christianity. If that is the case, and if it was the Passover night when they were supposed to eat and he refused, he sinned and he is not the Messiah. Would that not be true? Because while he was here in the flesh, he was still under the Old Testament dispensation. Because what he was doing was passing the baton to the disciples, who were then transferring us into the New Testament dispensation. And so if he refused to eat the Passover, he would have been in violation of the Torah, which would have disqualified him from being our Messiah. So surely that could not have happened. He was still under the Old Testament dispensation, as I said before, and as such was legally required to eat the Passover on the 14th. The question here is, do we believe Yeshua's words over tradition? Let me repeat. The question here is, do we believe Yeshua's words over tradition? And I would sadly say, no, we do not. No, we do not. Too many, and I would say the majority of those in the body of Messiah, and is not meant as a condemnational statement, it is made as a statement of fact, do not believe Yeshua's words. I am finding this troubling because what I'm finding, like not only this subject, I'm finding many other subjects that when Yeshua makes certain statements, they disregard those statements and say he didn't mean that or he didn't say that. Yet dogmatically, ad verbum, word for word, he makes certain statements and they say, no, he didn't say that. And they try to find some kind of a creative self-rationalization way to reason away what Yeshua said. And this is what we're going to investigate in this lesson here this week. So let's look at all the places where Yeshua said he would eat the Passover. I went through all of the Gospels and into Acts, and I found every scripture that I could find where Yeshua talks directly on this subject. And we're going to go through it. It's a little meticulous, but we're going to go through it because I want there to be no doubt in the mind of anybody who's watching this or is in earshot of my voice that Yeshua meant what he said and he said what he meant. And that we are confused. We have taken on the covenant of Hagar because we've accepted what Judaism has told us, and it's a covenant of flesh. And we're using our flesh to reason these traditions as being dogma, and they're not to be messed with. I'm going to mess with it, and I'm going to do it now. Let's get started. The first place we find is in Matthew chapter 26, verse 17 through 20. Now, on the first day of the feast, this feast is not in the original text, if you'll look for it, and it was added. But let's move on. Of unleavened bread, which is azumus. That means that it's uncorrupted bread. The disciples came to Yeshua saying to him, where and in what locality do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover? Now, this is the disciples talking. Okay, this is not Yeshua, this is the disciples at this point. And the special sacrifice connected to it. So this word pasha means and the special sacrifice connected to it. That's what's in the Greek. And I'm finding that too many of these people that are holding on to this other idea that it's to be eaten on the first day of unleavened bread on the evening of the 15th are not going in and looking at the original language. And that what they're doing is they're taking commentaries, which is men's traditions, and they're inserting them in some of these verses to make it look like it's part of the verse, but it's not in the original language. And that's another dangerous area because Yahweh tells us in the Torah not to add to my Torah and not to take away from. And they're adding words like between the evenings. They're adding words like, what's the other one? It escapes me right now. In the afternoon is another one. Doesn't appear in Scripture. But they're putting it in there as if to make you think like, just accept it. And so many have accepted it because they've not challenged to see whether between the evenings and in the afternoon in the Exodus is actually in there. And it's not. It's not in the Hebrew. Let's move on. Verse 18. And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, my time is at hand, I will keep and fulfill by observing and performing the Passover. The word poio means fulfill by observing and performing. What does that mean? In my English, it means he's going to observe by performing the Passover, Pascha, and the special sacrifice that's connected to it. At your house with my disciples. Now we're starting to get into what Yeshua is saying. This is what he's saying. And we've got to wake up in the body of Messiah, and we've got to start looking at and questioning, why do I not accept Yeshua's own words? Remember what he said, my sheep hear my voice, and they follow me wherever I go. But why won't you hear his voice here? And you say, well, John, that's just one verse. Sit tight. Take a chill pill, because I got more coming. I'm going to unload it. I'm in front of the judge, and I'm pleading this case. And I will win this case with the facts that I'm presenting. There's no doubt in my mind about it. Let's move on. So the disciples did as Yeshua had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. When evening, early nighttime had come, he sat down with the 12. Now, this starts to get a little bit technical, and when we get into the other lessons in the coming weeks, I will go into more detail about this idea about what is evening and all that. And I think you're going to find it kind of fascinating with the presentation that I'm going to give. I might be next week, I'm not sure, certainly by the one after. Depends on how much I've got to deal with. In Mark chapter 14, pressing on, verses 12 through 18, it says, now on the first day of unleavened bread, which is asmus, that is uncorrupted, when they kill the Passover and the special sacrifice connected to it, which is the lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the meat of the Passover?" This word, phago, in the Greek means meat of. So clearly Yeshua, the allusion here, what they're alluding to is that Yeshua is going to eat the meat of the Passover. And yet this is the one argument that we're hearing all the time. He did not eat a Passover meal. But they're saying he's going to eat the meat of the Passover meal. You're arguing against the disciples. You're arguing against Yeshua. And you're destroying your own ability to understand the true weight of what this day is all about, because you're substituting man's traditions for what Yeshua is trying to point back to. See, what we got to look at is that when Moses and the Israelites kept the Passover on the 14th of Nissan in Israel at that time, that was the shadow picture. That was the rehearsal for what Yeshua was going to do when he came here. And so by the time Yeshua comes to this Passover evening, the Jews have a completely different day, a completely different celebration. They've undone the Torah, as Yeshua said. And what he's doing with his disciples is giving us an example of pointing us back to the Torah and the way it was done back then. He's reestablishing the true shadow picture, the true rehearsal, the true moedim of how it should have been done. And yet we find through these accounts, we'll see, that the next day they're doing their tradition. On the next evening they're eating their Passover. So clearly there were two calendars going on here. Yeshua and the disciples were eating their Passover on one night, and the Jews were eating their Passover on the next night. So clearly there's a conflict. Clearly there's a conflict. You have to at least admit to the fact that there is a conflict, that we got two Passovers going on here. And I'm going to put my buck on Yeshua. Because if it doesn't square with Yeshua, then we need to cast it out. We need to get rid of it. Let's move on. Verse 13. And he sent out two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher," which is keramion, which is of earthenware, so I'm thinking it's probably clay, "of water, follow him. Wherever he goes, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest room?" Which is, and it's interesting because this word guest room means that it is used for the end of a journey. So apparently this guest room is designed for people who are traveling from great distances and they're coming to an end of a journey. They give them this room to go and rest and end their journey. I found that interesting in the Greek. In which Yeshua, I think this is Yeshua speaking, isn't it? That Yeshua, may eat the Passover. This is another account where Yeshua is saying he's going to eat this Passover. But why are we yelling and screaming and condemning people for teaching this when Yeshua is saying that and you're fighting against Yeshua? In his own words. You don't want to accept what Yeshua is saying? That he's going to eat this Passover? The only way I could buy that is you'd have to find some kind of historical proof that these texts never really existed. That's the only way you're going to get me to buy into that one. And you better be really good at proving to me from the historical text that these things never existed. We got more. I'm going to go through plenty more. Let's move on. And the special sacrifice connected to it with my disciples. Then he will show you a large, exceedingly great upper room, which is a balcony on an upper floor, or a second floor, it also says, furnished and prepared, there make ready for us. Let's move on. So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Here we are again, preparing the Passover. Let's move on. Mark chapter 14, verses 12 through 18. We're continuing. In the evening, here's this word again. As the sun set at the close of the day, when night starts, he came with the 12. Verse 18. Now as they sat in a reclining sideways position and ate, Yeshua said, "Surely I say to you, one of you who eats with me," so he's saying he's eating, "will betray me." Now, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in Luke chapter 22, verse 1, and then we'll jump to verse 6. It says, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew near, which is called the Passover. The Feast of Unleavened Bread that drew near, which is called the Passover. We have to understand that a lot of people are confused in the body of Messiah about this verse. But what we have to understand is that there are actually 8 days of unleavened bread. 7 of them are specifically called the days of Hamatzot. Different feasts for a different purpose. But on Passover, you're supposed to eat unleavened bread, not leavened bread. Not supposed to eat leavened bread. And yet, well, we'll get into that in a little bit. I don't want to get ahead of myself. So that's what it's sometimes referred to as the Passover as a day of unleavened bread, because it is a day of unleavened bread. So he promised, cutting into verse 6 now, so he promised and sought opportunity with a favorable occasion to betray him, this is speaking of Judas betraying Yeshua, in the presence of the multitude. Then came or grew on the 13th toward the day of unleavened bread, which this is the Passover. Because again, it's the same thought process as in that verse 1, that it is the first day of unleavened bread, even though it's a Passover, because it's the first day you're going to eat unleavened bread for the next 8 days. It's a play on words. When the Passover must be killed. So we're being taught here. Again, on the Passover is when it's going to be killed and sacrificed in the fire. So in verse 8, moving on, it says, and he sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover, Pascha, and the special sacrifice connected to it for us, that we may eat. Yeshua is including himself in the group. We means collectively. We will eat this Passover, which is a special sacrifice connected to the Passover. And the word eat means meat. I didn't, it said it, I say it there. I didn't see that. It's the meat. So he's going to eat with his disciples the meat. So here we're going, Scripture after Scripture, going through these Gospels, we're seeing over and over again, a little bit of different perspectives, but it's all coming back to the same thing. All the disciples are all agreeing with each other that Yeshua said he will eat it with them, and he did eat. They're all saying that. So they said to him, where do you want us to prepare? Verse 9. Verse 10. And he said to him, behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher, which is earthenware, of water, which I find interesting. We'll revisit this in a little bit, for a shower from rain. And follow him into the house which he enters. Then in verse 11, you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room? Here it is again, that is used for one at the end of his journey, where here we go again. Yeshua is saying again that I may eat the Passover with my disciples. I just don't see how you can construe Yeshua's words to mean something other than what he said. Then he will show you a large, exceedingly great, furnished upper room on the second floor. There make ready. Moving on, verse 13. So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come, he sat in a reclining position down, and the 12 apostles with him. Verse 15. Then he said to them, with fervent desire. Now look at this, because now he's adding an emphasis. Not just that I'm going to sit down and eat with you guys, but I have a fervent desire. Now I'm burning with passion to get this over with. A fervent desire I have to eat this Passover with you. What? Before or prior to that which I suffer. Wait a minute. I'm confused, because our traditions, as many of us have been keeping, show that he didn't eat the Passover that night. It was just a Last Supper. And that they ate the Passover the night before. But he's saying, if I'm reading this right, if I'm reading it wrong, you yell out and say, John, you're a heretic. You're reading it wrong. But I'm going to read it again. It says, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover. Not last year's, not the year to come next year, but this Passover with you, before and prior to that which I suffer. Now in my book, there's only one timeline that fits that. On the evening of the 14th of Nissan, when the sun had set on the 13th. I don't see how you can cut this some other kind of way. It does not make any sense. And I would venture to say, if you stood in front of a judge and you tried to plead that case, you're going to have a rough time overcoming this, and as well as all the other words that Yeshua said. And so it comes back again to what I had read from the beginning. And that is, if we believe Moses' words, do we believe Moses' words? Because if we can't accept what he says, we can't accept what Yeshua is telling us here so plainly. This is plain English. Let's move on. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom. So what he's saying is, he's talking in present tense. I'm eating it now, but then right after this, no longer after this moment when I'm eating it, no longer after this will I eat it, until it's fulfilled and completed in the kingdom of Yahweh. Let's move on. Verse 17, then he took the cup, gave thanks, and said, take this and divide it amongst yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of Yahweh comes. Interestingly, he doesn't say, I will not drink of it again. Anyway, let's move on. And he took the bread, which, interestingly, this is an important point. You see, people in the argument with the Passover being eaten on the 15th of Nissan, which is the first day of unleavened bread after the Passover, they tried to say, and there's a famous Torah teacher who says this, or he used to, I don't know if he still does, he says, he completely ignored in the Greek what it said, the showbread. And in his teaching, he said it was a loaf. Okay? And that means a loaf, you tear it. And it was raised bread. It was raised or leavened bread. Now, it doesn't say that in the Greek, but he construed it to be that way. And yet, what we find is the word artus. And it means showbread. Now, if you go back to the Torah and you look at the showbread in the temple, it's unleavened bread. And gave thanks and broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Let's go to verse 20 now. Continuing back with Luke chapter 22. Likewise, he also took the cup, which, it's interesting, in the Greek it means a lot or fate and drought. So it's a cup of fate, basically. After supper, evening meal, and that comes from number 1173, means a feast supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. Now, therefore, in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, it says, now, therefore, moving on to another account. Again, what we're doing is we're rehashing everything Yeshua said about himself in regards to the Passover. Now, therefore, and I've interjected this part, on the 13th, just prior to the feast, which is a festival of the Passover, when Yeshua knew and perceived that his hour or season had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Verse 2, and the supper being ended, the devil having already put in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. Verse 3, Yeshua, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from Yahweh and was going to Yahweh, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, and took a towel and girded himself. Verse 5, after that he poured water. Remember what I told you to pay attention about that water, the good man with the water? It's the same word, for a shower from rain. Is it possible that the man with the pitcher of water went to get that pitcher of water for the Passover ceremony for Yeshua? It's the exact same word that's being used here. So it seems like Yeshua picked up that same pitcher, earthen vessel of rainwater, which is for a shower to wash oneself, into a basin for a ceremony. And the word basin is a basin for a ceremony. It's not just a regular basin, but it's a basin designed for a ceremony, consecrated for that. And began to wash his disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Now, let's take a look at the other Passover meal in the gospel accounts. And there's a few. In John chapter 18, verse 28, it says, Then they led Yeshua from Caiaphas to the praetorium, which is basically a courtroom, and it was early in the morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled. And that means contaminated morally. But that they may eat the Passover. So here we are, the night before Yeshua and the disciples ate their Passover. Now it's early in the morning when the sun's getting ready to come up. It's a different day, and they won't go into this praetorium because they don't want to be ceremonially corrupted, because they still haven't eaten their Passover meal yet. That's going to be later in the afternoon. So let's move on. They are going to eat it that night, which is the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th of Nissan. Let's look at John chapter 19, verse 14. The Jews' Passover, not Yeshua's. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover and about the 6th hour. You see, because the Passover still is a preparation day, but what the Jews did is they moved it forward in the afternoon portion of the 14th to make that the preparation for the 15th when they'll eat their Passover. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. This was the Jews' preparation day to make ready to eat the Passover that night on the first day of unleavened bread, which is the 15th. In Acts chapter 12, verse 3 through 4, we see the Passover week of the Jews. And because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread, that is uncorrupted Passover week of the Jews. That's what it says in the Greek. Verse 4, So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison and delivered him to the four squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after the Passover. After the Passover week, I should say. Judaism calls the Passover as 8 days of Passover or Passover week. Nowhere in Torah can we go in the Torah and find that we have 8 days of Passover. That's an oxymoron. I mean, Yahweh passed over the sins of Israel on one night. He doesn't pass over them for 8 days. It doesn't make any sense. Again, this is a watering down of Torah. It's a watering down of Yahweh's instructions. And what it does is Hasatan uses that to delude people into making no distinction between the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. You see, you can't be de-leavened of sin until you're first sanctified by the blood of Yeshua on Passover by the shedding of his blood. Once his blood is shed, and that's on the doorposts of your heart, now when the next day comes, you are de-leavened. You have no sin, you have no transgressions, you have nothing against you. That's what the days of unleavened bread are about. They have nothing to do with the Passover. Passover has its purpose. Days of unleavened bread have their spiritual significance. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 11 and 12, it says, How is it you do not understand and exercise your mind to comprehend? You see, what this is telling us is that the reason a lot of times why people don't understand what's being spoken to them is because they don't set their mind by exercising it to comprehend. It's easier just to accept what somebody's telling you as truth. But you have to make a conscious decision that you're going to challenge this so-called truth and see whether it's so or not, like the Bereans. But too many of us don't. We come into this, it's given to us on a silver plate just this way, accept it, this is what's been done for thousands of years, the Jews know what they're doing, this is correct, don't challenge it. Anybody who tries to tell you something else, they've got doctrines of demons, that's what they'll tell you. But I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You see, this idea of the Passover being eaten on the night of unleavened bread is the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. It is their doctrine. Literally. And he's telling you not to eat of the bread, but don't eat of their doctrine. And yet this is the doctrine we're eating today in the body of Messiah. We're eating the doctrine of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Verse 12, Then they understood that he did not tell them to be aware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and the Sadducees.
Restoring the Father's name Yahweh. Restoring the Messiah's name Yahshua. Re-establishing Torah covenant.